Okay, so hi everyone. Sorry for the mishap. Thank you for coming along. I'm Aaron, one of the co-chairs for the Sydney BE meetup, and lovely to see you all here today. Before we kick off, I just want to do a big shout out to UTS Futures Academy for helping us host tonight. They literally saved my bacon a couple of minutes ago. So big thanks to them. Without them, none of this would be possible. So thank you to UTS Futures. We're really lucky to have Merle tonight, talking about how payment methods impact our financial behaviour. Many of you may know that Merle is Behavioural Scientist Manager over at CBA. Before this, she completed her PhD in Behavioural Science at the Warwick Business School over in the UK, studying how people spend their money and savings as well, how people spend and manage their money. This is a key topic that Merle is very passionate about, and she has a blog called Money on the Mind, which I'm sure a lot of you know, but if you haven't seen it, go check it out. Definitely worth a read.
Maybe eventually I can trick Aaron into also doing an interview on that blog.
One day.
One day.
Whatever I can do to help you. And I was talking to Merle before, asking how she wants to run the session. And if anyone's got a question, put your hand up or type it in the chat and we'll pick them up as we go along. Is that right?
Yeah, if they can't unmute themselves and just scream through, which is also perfectly fine. As I said to Aaron, I tend to go on tangents. You're better off asking your question as soon as you have it. Otherwise, we might not make it to the end of this presentation at all.
So we might just do a test. Julian, could you just raise your hand, mate? I just want to see if Merle can see that.
Yeah, I can. Well, I can because I have this on full screen. We'll see how we go as soon as I have a presentation on. I can see Stefano's hand too.
Okay, I'll call out if I see anything that you haven't. But without further ado.
Then I will share my screen and hope for the best. And then hopefully you can now see this presentation in full. Otherwise, this is going to be even more of a technical issue fixing.
It's all good.
Awesome. All right. So very unsurprisingly, for those who know me or for those who read the title of today's meetup, we're going to discuss the effect of payment method on consumer financial decision making by me. There we go. That's it. Very simple agenda, and I hope the chat isn't in the way of this. We're going to look at payments past, present, and potentially future. Well, we'll definitely look at it, but the future is still uncertain, and quite frankly, it's a bit unsure as to where exactly we're going. For the past, we're going to dive back into the credit card, which started most of this research, and then a bit about the debit card. We're going to look at our present, and you can see that we've got much more going on there. And then, like I said, we'll dive into the future and I'm very happy for you to raise any questions and have any discussion throughout. So please just make yourselves heard. So payments past. So what money have we seen so far, and what effects does it have, or to some extent, which effects do we think it has? Because not everything replicated as well as we would have liked, but then again, we are behavioral scientists. So from cash to card, several studies have compared credit cards and cash, and they found credit cards to be linked to an increased willingness to pay and spending. That's a pretty robust one. There's really not much doubt around that one. A less accurate expenditure recall. If you spend with cash, it's pretty limited and you're gonna know when you're out, and once you're out, you'll pretty much know how much has gone. With a credit card, not that likely, I'm afraid. There's also been a reduced impulse control leading to more frequent spending. So the reduced impulse control is, again, because people are a lot less limited in the amount of money that they have. If money is always available to you, it's super, super easy to buy that one additional thing, even if it's just that one chocolate bar at the counter when you were waiting to check out. If you don't have the cash for it, you can't buy the Kit Kat. If you have the credit card for it, you can buy the Kit Kat. It makes all the difference. The more frequent spending that follows from that is still a bit debatable. But given that spending frequency goes up anyway, this seems to be a pretty robust finding as well. Debt accumulation, hardly surprising for anyone who's ever owned a credit card. A reduced attachment to purchases. So if you buy on a credit card, you actually rate the your sense of ownership, but also your sense of attachment, how much you enjoy it, and how well you actually remember how and when you bought it, as just much lower. So if you really want to love something, buy it with cash. just a pro tip for your own utility. What's also been shown, although with this experiment, I've got rather more question marks. If you want me to describe the experiment, just give me a shout, happy to do so, that there was an increased focus on the product benefits rather than the cost of the product when people were paying with credit cards. The reason I've got some question marks with this one is because it wasn't really paying with credit card stimuli were present, and participants were essentially primed, which to me is not necessarily the same thing. Now, when it comes to debit cards, there haven't been as many studies. They have found, Randemark et al. Have found a higher willingness to pay as well, replicating one of the credit card studies. And there's also a higher chance of having revolving debt if you have a debit card. The chances of having revolving debt were lower if you didn't have a debit card, but you can maybe spot a massive confound there, which is that to have revolving debt, you would need a credit card and not a debit card, but they do somehow seem to link to each other. Excuse the reference there, I clearly forgot which year it was from. Happy to look that up for you though, if you're very much inclined. Now, if you can tell by this beautiful slide, there is a reason why, or at least once we've had the credit and debit card in our lives and they had been popularized and normalized, theories came about to actually explain why this was. Now, keep in mind, very quick history lesson. In most of the West, so then I'm talking Western Europe and America, I don't want to quote how the development was for Australia, because quite frankly, I don't know. And you guys have been really quite advanced when it comes to payment technology. So in America and Western Europe, around the 1960s, credit cards became increasingly popular. They were presented as a consumption smoothing tool. So to the benefit of the consumer, they somehow forgot to mention that potentially an interest rate of anywhere between 20 to 28% might not be necessarily beneficial to the consumer. But hey, that's for the marketing team to resolve. And if it goes absolutely terribly wrong, that's for the legal team to resolve. Anyway, credit cards became popular around the 60s. Debit cards became popular around the late 80s, early 90s, at least for the areas I've just described. Now, the research that looks at the effect of credit card on consumer financial outcomes is much younger. It actually took until mostly the late 80s and then the early 90s, and of course a lot in the early 2000s as well, for academics, or at least for the real world, to have caught up to, I don't think this is right, I think something is going on here. And as soon as these effects that I've just described in the previous slide came to light, a lot of people wanted to figure out why this was, because you can't just tell people, hey, this piece of plastic makes you worse off, and a lot of the financial outcomes just mentioned. People want to know why. Or at least, lots of academics were like, I can slap my name on a theory, which is a perfectly valid way to do it. So one of such an academic, although he's no longer an academic, he's currently, well, he's what I would call a hybrid. So Ofer Zellermeyer still teaches, but he's mainly a practitioner back in Israel. And in 1996, he finished his PhD under the guiding eye of George Lowenstein, and he came up with a theory of the pain of paying. Now, the pain of paying is essentially all the negative feelings associated with the act of paying. And as you can tell by the lovely smileys on the screen, cash is very, very, very painful. Debit card is all right. And credit card is exactly where it's at. But why is that? Because these things, when push comes to shove, you're still just spending resources, and you will lose the resources in exchange for the good or service just purchased. He came up with three main criteria. The first one was physicality. With cash, you actually have to hand something over physically. The actual action is there. And then if you get change back, well, you do get the resource back, but obviously to a much lesser extent. Debit and credit card, not so much. You hand over an entire plastic card, you tap it or swipe it, or your signature is put somewhere, but you get the entire card back. It's not like if you spend half your balance, suddenly, someone cuts the card in two, and then you've lost half your card. It's not how it works, probably for the best. There's also a lot less value representation when looking at a card, because your card doesn't reflect the balance that is on there and the amount of resources that you are losing throughout a transaction. With cash, as I've just described, that is very much present. And then, of course, the final kicker, which is why a credit card is emotionally preferred to a debit card, and especially to cash, is concurrency. With a credit card, you have all of the pleasure and the immediate gratification of the good or service that you have just bought. However, the actual incurring of the cost, which is where most of the negative feelings in paying come from, is deferred. So these two things are very much detached from each other. There is a temporal distance between the pleasure and then also the cost of the product, whereas the action of paying comes immediately with the pleasure. The cost just doesn't. Debit card and cash, they are both concurrent, and as a result, they are experienced more negatively or more painfully, if you will. And as a result, cash is much more painful as it ranks very high on these three dimensions. The credit card doesn't rank high on these at all, so it's much less painful or more pleasant, if you will, and the debit card kind of sits in the middle. Obviously, as I just mentioned, the pain of paying or any of the negative feelings associated with paying are all offset by the gratification of the purchase. There is a large literature on this that for some people, so spendthrifts, as they have been dubbed, they don't really care. They like to spend money anyway. The pain of paying for them is relatively low, especially as compared to the gratification of the purchase. Whereas for other people, the tightwads in this scenario, the pain of paying is always high, and the gratification of the purchase is just not high enough to set it off. And as a result, they don't like spending. That is essentially how that works. Most of that work is by Brian Knudsen, if I'm correct. Might come back to that one. So what does this actually look like if we dive very quickly into some neuroscience? One of my favorite fields, actually. They've lost a great neuroscientist in me. Well, they probably didn't, but that's what I tell myself to feel good about myself. So the most famous neuroscience paper in this space is by Knudsen. So I do think I got it right. They had participants go through an online shopping task whilst measuring their brain activity in a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, also known as fMRI. They measured activity in the insular cortex. This brain part is associated with the experiencing of actual physical pain. And they then also measured activity in the striatum, which is associated with reward, more specifically anticipated reward. When activity in the insular cortex was larger than that in the striatum, there was no purchase, as there was more pain than pleasure. And of course, when the opposite held true, so when there was more activity in the striatum as compared to the insular cortex, it was too pleasant not to purchase. As I said, people who experience a lot of pain were dubbed as tightwads. They don't like to spend. The opposite is labeled as a spendthrift. As a result of this, the pain of paying actually had a neural basis. And this is a really good way of explaining what's going on. And it's very easy to link that to payment methods as well. However, 10 years after this piece of evidence, and building on this piece of evidence, Banker et al. Have also conducted some research, and they specifically looked at whether the pain of paying on a neurological level could explain what the differences between credit card and cash. And the issue is they didn't find that, which is unfortunate, because of course this would have been the seminal finding. This would have all very neatly tied it together and be like, yeah, pain of paying works and explains, completely and neurologically what we've believed to have been true behaviorally for the past 20 years. Unfortunately, it didn't. So what happened was that there were no differences in pain experience when paying by credit card versus cash, as measured by insular cortex activity. What they did find is that there were differences in, I just realized that this is not the right version of my slides, which is great, very professional. If this is being sent around to my colleagues, this is not going to look good for me. However, they did show that there were different activations in a different brain part, which I will look up and circulate, which hinted at the fact that credit cards, rather than reducing pain, that they reduced price sensitivity. Now, I have a feeling this is somewhere in the orbitofrontal cortex, but I wouldn't stake my life on it if I'm being very honest, but I will look this up later. And I will label my slides better the next time around, I promise. So not the pain of paying per se, not necessarily pain, but just less sensitivity. which is very, very interesting, which means that if you're walking through a store and you see anything being on what you would normally argue would be relatively expensive. So if you were to walk into the store and you see a specific item, you would judge it apparently as being more expensive, or you'd be less willing to purchase it, granted if you walked in with cash. But then compared to you walking in with a credit card, you'd be less sensitive to the price. The price wouldn't matter as much in this specific scenario, which might actually tie back into the Chattery and Rose study, which showed that most participants, when they have a credit card, when they were primed with a credit card, have a very different focus when looking at the product. They focus much more on the benefits rather than on the costs. And although I didn't find the study design particularly convincing, neurologically, that is one of the few studies that is completely backed up. The joys of doing science. So that's the payments past, looking at credit and debit. Now, I call it payments past, but obviously we still use credit and debit. Credit is falling increasingly out of favor with young adults, but it is still, used all over the world to consumers' benefit, and to sometimes also very much their own detriment. So let's look at the present. What money are we using now, and how is it still affecting us, if it is still affecting us? So we went from paper to plastic, but we haven't exactly stopped there. From there on, we've also gone to the phone. Now, if we just look back at cards, so look back at a bit of plastic, what we have seen is that these methods are becoming easier and easier. So like getting a plastic card and having to get your PIN out, having to sign, it's not particularly hard. There's many harder things to do in life. But at the point of sale, if you're in a rush, it's just tedious. Now, people were kind enough to make sure that you don't have to find that tedious anymore, because they came up with contactless. So contactless works with RFID, or near field communication, known as NFC. And it just means that you tap a card or a device against a payment terminal and you're good to go under a certain amount of money. But those limits have been increasing and increasing throughout. Now, the one thing is that, it's convenient, great. But as you've probably gathered from the previous slides, convenience is not necessarily beneficial, especially not if you're on a budget. And if your budget's very tight, I don't think easy payment methods are the ones that you want to use, especially not as contactless cards. So the easiest card to use, if you will, has also been linked to higher spending at the point of sale or per month, which is my own study. It has also been linked to more frequent expenditure. So now we're getting back to the slide, the impulses that apparently aren't inhibited as much. They've also been linked to a reduced awareness of spending, so that people simply can't recall accurately how much they have spent. Again, I've also done work on this. And there's also, apparently from a consumer perspective, this was a qualitative study, there is a perceived loss of control when using these cards. To explain this a bit, the participants in that qualitative study, when push came to shove, didn't really know where their money was going, and they thought it was super easy to spend, and then asked to rate how much in control they still felt over their money. And in terms of budgeting, they rated that as significantly lower compared to those who only used cash. So that is what's going on in terms of perceived control. Now, as I said, we're also looking at the phone. So several studies have also compared mobile payments to cash, and they found mobile payments, or having mobile payments, to be linked to an increased likelihood of exhibiting costly credit card behavior. This warrants slightly more explaining. So a costly credit card behavior is, for example, only really repaying the minimum, constantly revolving your debt. Things like this. This is very costly to do. There's always also been strong association between mobile payment adoption and high cost debt. So in that case, you can think of very high APR credit cards, but you can also think of payday loans. And payday loans were a subset of the high cost debt that this research was looking at. Trouble with financial management, so having too much month left at the end of your money, as the Dutch say very ironically. And again, high cost credit card behavior, which had a slightly different definition in this study. In this study, it was again only paying the minimum, revolving the full balance, but also taking out cash advances against the credit card, which is also very, very expensive to do. For context, this study was set in the States. Most of these studies are. Now, my supervisors and I, we also find increased value and frequency of spending per month. And then there was a working paper that found that if you paid by mobile or through mobile gadgets, you actually had a reduced pain of paying. Given that the pain of paying might not work as well as we had thought for different payment methods, feel free to interpret that result as broadly as you like. Now, I have realized that these tables do not copy over as well as I had hoped, but this is one of the researches that I have done. So one of the studies I just described earlier, where we looked at contactless payments. Now, to actually help you out rather than just throw 3 massive tables at you, what we did here was we looked at a sample of the UK population, which had a financial tracker app installed on their phone, so they could figure out where their money was going if they so desired. They signed up several accounts. We only looked at people with at least 2 accounts, and then we made sure that one of these accounts had contactless usage on it and one of these accounts did not. So that is the sample that we're working with. Then for each of these contactless users, we took 1 year before and 1 year after, and we compared the subject against themselves in terms of what was going on. Now, the first table, as you can tell, is for the contactless account. So this is of the contactless user, this is the account that contactless did get activated on. What we see then is if comparing the data of the year after they started using contactless to the year before, what we can see is that they do spend frequently, they do spend significantly more frequently, they do spend more, and significantly more as well. In terms of overdraft, nothing's really happening. Nothing's happening in terms of unsecured loans either. So that's really good. You know, given that a lot of payments were associated to, for example, high cost loans such as paydays, this is really good that we don't find any of this. But what we also find is that cash transactions went significantly up, savings went up significantly. Nothing seems to happen in terms of credit card debt. And we also see that more money moves into the account. So, you know, perfectly happy that spending is going up. Well, I'm not happy, but it's in line with most theories. But the idea that savings is also going up is a bit odd. Now, if we then look at the second table, again, year before, year after. However, this is on the non-contactless account. So nothing really changes much on this account. As you can see, nothing shows up as significant. Actually, realistically, nothing is happening on this account at all. Seem to be no changes, remains very stagnant. But then if we look at the last table, which is the overall user picture, so this is no longer on the account level, on the user level, we continue to see that, you know, across the user level, we continue to see all the effects that we've just seen as well. But what we also continue to see, and how we explain what was actually going on, is that for both the contactless accounts, so table 1, and then table 3, the contactless user, transfers remain significant, and they are also rather large. Now, if we look at the values of the transfers, so in this case, they are positive, which means more money is going into the account than is going out. These transfers, if you add up both spending and credits, if you add up both spending and savings, these transfers actually explain a decent chunk of what's going on. So what we figured out is that the contactless account simply is the account that has more activity drawn to it, very likely because it is easier to use. Now, we did the exact same thing for mobile payments. When it comes to having found something that works, most academics just copy paste. But then again, you know, we just call that a replication and get away with it. So it works very well for us. So we did exactly the same thing. As I said, with mobile payments, we found a slightly different picture in terms of how the accounts map onto each other. But in terms of the consumer outcomes, we find the exact same things. We find that transactions go up, spending goes up. Nothing really happens in terms of overdraft, although the likelihood of incurring one actually significantly goes down. Although, you know, this level of significance, you know, take it or leave it rather. Again, nothing happens on unsecured loans, which I'm really happy, I'm really glad to see. And again, savings goes up, nothing happens in terms of debt. But in this case, also nothing happens in terms of credits or transfers. So this account just has more money flowing out of it and money isn't being pumped into it from anywhere else. However, what we do see, if we then look at table 2, on the non-active account, most things go down. The number of transactions actually goes significantly down, the rest doesn't. But we do find that this is highly indicative of a compensation mechanism where, rather than what we saw in the previous study with contactless, where actively money is being shifted, what we see here is that the mobile enabled account just again becomes more active, but this might have been the dominant account from the get-go, so money doesn't have to be shifted here. The effects are also smaller. I don't expect you to know the numbers by heart, I really don't. But if we look at the overall user level, we see that due to this compensation mechanism and due to this very slight shift, transactions go up significantly, but this is an additional 3 transactions per month. Something I probably should have mentioned is that these measures are all per month. This is not per week or per fortnight. Might have been good to know. And the fixed effects are also at the month and user level. And we're also measuring income, as you can tell. So overall, on the user level, when you start using mobile payments, your transactions do increase significantly. Your savings increase significantly as well. You do get about £30 extra per month. You know, take it or leave it, I suppose. But most of these numbers have lost significance as compared to the mobile account, because there is a compensation mechanism here. So the significantly increase in spending that we expected to see does no longer persists here. So it does raise a very interesting question in terms of how mobile payments compare to contactless payments, because the numbers for contactless payments are much more extreme. So in terms of what is more abstract or what might be more detrimental to the consumer, well, from the findings that we have, we might actually say that contactless cards are more detrimental to the consumer than mobile payments, but that is not necessarily something that other studies have found. So I am curious to see if more research in that area tells us where we can go from here. You know, a single study does not in effect make. Now, another thing to look into is that beyond these much more physical payment methods, I mean, you do kind of have to go to a point of sale to pay with either contactless or mobile. You don't really have to pay in real life anymore, and most people aren't really bothered. This is a trend that was occurring before the pandemic hit, but the pandemic definitely made this trend persist and increased its persistence exponentially. I don't think that was a good English sentence, please bear with. So what we've seen is that most payment systems have shifted online, and they've shifted online really, really well. Amazon is booming, eBay is booming, and these platforms, as well as any self-respecting online retailer these days, have a form of BNPL. I remember specifically trying to buy a fridge online, as I had recently moved here, and I was looking for the tweets, but I could no longer find it. But my so I think I bought my fridge with appliances online or with The Good Guys, both Australian companies I'm sure you're all very familiar with. And I had 9 different BNPL options to buy said fridge. I did not buy it using BNPL, I will have you know, but I did think that having 9 options really was the choice overload I was not looking for. But it's good to know that these options are there if you really want them. I find BNPL a very ironic product, and I'll happily explain to you why. So for most young adults, so think about 35 years and under, credit cards or having this type of debt is really falling out of favor. So most of the younger consumers, they are really debt averse. However, they're also the main market having an interest in BNPL product holdings. Now, I know a BNPL is not exactly the same as a credit card, but it is a way to consumption smooth where you do owe a large amount of money and can just push it forward until you really do have to repay it. And still lots of people are struggling to repay their BNPL. There are currently millions and millions of dollars in debt, consumer debt on BNPL systems as well. So they might have been introduced with the best intentions, maybe not, maybe they did, who knows, but they're not solving the problem that they think they're solving, which is unfortunate. Also, unsurprisingly, cash usage is still on the decline, again, kind of aggravated by the pandemic. And concurrent payments are just on the decline in general. No one wants to pay right here, right now. No one really does. Now, knowing that is our past and our present, the question is, what exactly do we have to look forward to in terms of paying? And I have a feeling that you have absolutely nothing to look forward to. And I mean that in the way that you might not really have to pay much more these days. That's not saying it's not going to cost you anything, but the action of paying is apparently quite going out of fashion. Now, the pictures that you can see here, especially the one on the top right, is my favorite. Obviously, this is an Amazon Go store. I did expect these to become more popular than they have, given that there are literally no checkouts and no lines, which quite frankly sounds like heaven to me until you think about the fact that it's Amazon, and then it does sound like the devil trying to sell you a banana. But this store is designed in a way where you literally do not pay, or at least you don't have to stand in a queue and you don't have to go through the payment process. Not necessarily the same thing. So as this, I think most of you will have heard of this type of store. It works with facial recognition. At least that's what I've been told. And it can link you, or it can link your face, or it can link any type of data to who you are as a person, to the things that you've just walked away with, and then you will get a bill presented to you at the end of the day, or maybe the end of the week, or given that it's Amazon, probably at the end of the month, when you've got absolutely no idea what you have purchased, but you are still stuck with that bill, and that bill does need to be paid. But I'm sure they'll offer you a lovely payment plan against potentially an APR of anywhere between 15 to 35%. And guess what? This is now a credit card. Anyway, that is a future prediction on my part. I'm not saying this is Amazon strategy. I would not want to be accused of slander. So, a general summary. I have also absolutely no idea what time it is. So I don't know if I'm doing good or bad, and if there's any time left for a Q&A. So there's a general trend towards making money. Oh, hey, Aaron.
Hey, yeah, it's 6:46, but let's go a little bit longer. Just got a question from Paul. What do we know about the factors affecting trust and uptake of new payment technologies, e.g. age, education, metro/regional, etc.?
That is a really, really good question. So I can't actually tell you in terms of demographics what really happens with regards to trust. We do find that mostly young adults, they tend to be more tech savvy, and they tend to be more trusting in technology than older generations anyway. The main thing that helped contactless be picked up was the covering of contactless under the Credit Act, where even if someone had just stolen your card, that there was protection against, you know, the function on your card, and you only needed the card, you didn't need a PIN anymore. So even if someone could just, you know, took your card from you and then did a couple of contactless transactions, well, that would still be protected, and banks would guarantee that you would get your money back. And at least I know when that happened in the Netherlands, contactless became way more popular because, well, your money was protected. So when it comes to necessarily, I don't know if there's a lot of demographics related to trust, except for age. I know that for a fact. But it might also be the type of more legal and economic guarantees surrounding the product. As I've already mentioned, credit cards are falling out of favor with younger people. They tend to prefer BNPL. Again, most BNPLs are exclusively online, and they don't have the reputation of the credit card yet. So that there are demographic differences there. I think in general, when you're looking at age, there is a tendency to be more technologically savvy and to no longer have physical products, such as cash, but also such as having an actual plastic card. This is also obviously also much more common in what you could call high-tech societies. So it's really quite unsurprising that, for example, if you look at the payment method development in China, they moved essentially from all cash to almost fully digital. That was also a governmental drive, and it also has a lot to do with data. but there is a type of society that lends itself much better for this. And in a very similar vein, most of Scandinavia, which also has a very big government, albeit for very different reasons, most cash has also fallen out of favor, and they are also an almost exclusively digitalized economy, where I'm pretty sure Sweden even wanted to, Sweden has had talks about banning cash completely and going fully digital. And both India and Canada have had these discussions as well. Culturally, these are very different countries, but their economies and their type of government does lend themselves for this type of a transition. I hope that somewhat answers your question. I also feel like I could just open the chat. Oh, no, I should not scroll up in the chat. That really doesn't work.
No, there's another one that has come through. But do you want to do your summary slide, and then we'll come back to the question?
Oh yeah, I mean, the summary slide is not particularly impressive. So there's a general trend towards making money much more abstract. This is hardly surprising. Originally, at least, you still had something physical with a number on it. Now you have a mobile device that hopefully updates your balance as you go, but maybe not necessarily. This increased abstraction, although I don't think that's the right English word for it, tends to lead to more spending and a reduced awareness of spending, and more future spending as a result of that, because a reduced awareness has been linked to further spending. And then the concreteness of a payment can be reduced by using a payment method, but also through manipulating the purchasing experience in general. And the literature in consumer behavior on that is massive. So not just in consumer behavior, but also, of course, largely in marketing. So there's if that is something that you would find interesting, you should definitely look into that, because there's lots of stuff to be read there. That is essentially it. So I'm happy to take questions and stop sharing the slides.
Yeah, awesome. So firstly, thank you, Merle.
Sure.
That was awesome. So let's jump to the question that Neil's got for you. Any thoughts on good pain feedback versus bad pain friction in creating payment policy?
Oh, that is a really, really good one. So in terms of bad pain, I think bad pain is, and the issue I have with labeling something as bad pain is that it really depends on the individual. So if you are a tightwad type of a consumer, everything is going to hurt. Genuinely everything that you spend money on. But that also includes things that are more likely going to be investments or things that you need. There are things, like no one's going to become happy being a complete and utter Scrooge. That there are things, also good things in life, which cost money. So I would call that a bad pain, but that is also potentially because the person's attitude towards spending is not necessarily healthy. Of course, the opposite also holds true. Someone who doesn't experience any pain whatsoever and is a spendthrift. Now, the type of people who tend to really get into very bad consumer debt are obviously spendthrifts, because the average tightwad doesn't own a credit card. So in that case, that actually ramping up the level of pain that they could experience during a purchase. So having them contemplate much more if they need something, or making the process much more difficult. So having them have to count out cash, or something like this, that would be very beneficial in their case. Now, I don't think we've got more tightwads than we've got spendthrifts in our contemporary consumer society. But because there are such individual differences, I find it very difficult to design or even think about a single policy which would work for a lot of different types of consumers. Which does not answer your question at all. I'm sorry. If you have an idea for a payment policy, I'd love to hear it though.
Well, on that, we've got a question for Stuart. Loads of indicators out there that increased abstractions is also increasing greater fraud too. Perhaps the biometric ID controls will reduce that in the future. Any insights on how these methods correlate to fraud?
That is a very good question, Stuart. I have to admit, I am not a specialist on fraud. I think I will do the entire topic a disservice to even have an opinion about it. So if you would like to discuss this, please do. But I am staying away from it. I know several researchers in fraud who are doing an amazing job, and I'll leave that job to them.
Okay, got a question from Darren. Doesn't the increase in abstraction lead to better awareness by consolidating all the payment types and putting the allocation of funds to the payment in view of the consumer?
Can you repeat that?
Doesn't the increase in abstraction lead to better awareness by consolidating all the payment types and putting the allocation of funds to the payment in view of the consumer?
Oh, I see. So this is if I'm interpreting it correctly, this essentially would be a counter argument to having lots of separate things and then having lots of separate mental accounts, right? You can make that argument. So there is, and I didn't present these theories because then I definitely wouldn't have stayed under an hour. But when it comes to mobile payments, there is, and I've argued this, it is in my own thesis, because as I said, you know, we would be here much longer than an hour. Mobile payments could go either way, and as a result of it, I'm not super surprised that I found a much smaller effect for mobile payments than I found for contactless cards. So with mobile payments, you are looking at something really quite similar, where the device that is the payment method, the thing that spends, is also the thing that tracks. And that is a very, very interesting merger of these things, because most of the time when you spend on the phone, and this was actually initially installed as a way to check or to combat fraud, coming back to you, Stuart, but it was just a way to check it. If your phone had a message come through that said like, hey, you've just spent this much, if that wasn't actually you, your account had been hacked, or at least your phone payments have been hacked. Very clever, but it also worked in terms of salience. Not only had you just paid for the thing and you've gone through that process, you've just been sent a reminder that, yeah, you have really spent that type of money. It's like seeing the expenditure twice, which from a pain of paying, or at least a salience perspective, is very, very useful. It makes it slightly more painful, if you will. Now, I think having these two functions merged, where as soon as I spend something, I can continue to track accurately how much I've spent, I do think it helps and supports mental accounting. But the awareness that I now have of my spending has been induced by the fact that I've just gotten the information twice and I have very easy access to that information. That is the type of more of accuracy that is being increased. Whether I as an individual, if I did not have the supporting system, would be more accurate in recalling how much I had spent and how much I had left, that's not a claim I necessarily want to make. I do generally think if the payment method is more abstract and the idea of money is more abstract, that it just doesn't really click in your brain. Sure, our systems of tracking it have become better, but that's not the same as it being as salient or more salient for you as an individual. So if you didn't have the support systems, I do think you would struggle.
Another really interesting question from Paul. Has anyone successfully reduced the purchase of undesirable products, such as junk food or tobacco, by legally making them cash only?
Ooh, has someone done that? No. The junk food one is a very interesting one, because the study by Thomas et al. That found that people became more impulsive actually look at what people spend at the grocery store, and people who purchased with a credit card did actually end up buying more vice products, and one category of those vice products was junk food. So it's a very easy and a good link to make. So it I don't know. I think maybe turning that into a cash economy has both its benefits from a consumer perspective and how much you'd be willing to spend, and maybe holding yourself back. But if you look at junk food, I think there's an easy enough argument to make. If you're looking at tobacco and things which are essentially smuggled a lot already, I'm not sure if then you're opening yourself up to the black market even more. I'm sure there might be some legality issues there. I'm not saying fraud, I'm just saying not all of it. I'm just saying tax evasion, essentially, mainly tax evasion.
Would it reduce consumption because a cigarette, like a packet of cigarettes, is a higher cost item, right? And if cash is slowly going out of fashion, would it work that way?
I wonder. I mean, keep in mind, like if you're smoking or if you're excessively eating junk food, what you're looking at is not normal behavior. What you're looking at is an addiction. And if there's one thing that we know about addicts is that, you know, you can pull up all types of barriers, but an addict will try to get their fix. There's really interesting psychology on this, and how you design for behavioral addictions rather than physical addictions, although smoking is still a physical addiction, or substance addiction, if you will. But it's difficult. Especially behavioral addictions are not that well understood, and they are very difficult to disentangle. And I don't think like going back to cash is gonna fix that issue.
No. So we've got one from Andrew that I've posted in the chat.
Sure.
That you might want to pull up because it's a couple of parts to it.
Yeah, I've got it open. So let's see. So do I know how transaction value low versus high affects emotional and our cognitive responses across different payment channels? Andrew, if you don't mind, and yes, I see that you're typing on a phone, and I appreciate you joining through a phone. But you're gonna have to help me out here. What emotional and or cognitive responses that you are looking for? So what if I interpret it correctly? So if I buy something very small on a non-salient method, so let's say a contactless credit card, I think it doesn't make an impact at all. I think the impact of that low value transaction would be slightly higher with cash, but keep in mind it's a low value transaction. Unless it's like your favorite chocolate after you just had a terrible day, the impact that's going to have on you cognitively or emotionally is very unlikely, unless you attach a high cognitive or emotional value to the thing that you've just purchased. There's not much in terms of price or value, if you will, that's going to change that. In terms of having a very high value transaction, I think if you buy it with cash, at least from what we've seen so far, you will have had much more of a cognitive effort and trajectory towards this purchase than had you paid it on a less salient and easier method. Keep in mind, if you want to pay with cash for something that requires a lot of money, most of the time you're going to have to plan that out. It's unlikely that you've got a lot of high denominations on you, that you have to have a high amount of cash on you these days, in most contemporary Western societies at least. So it requires planning, it requires cognitive effort. And as a result, I think once you do purchase that thing, as a result of all the effort and the planning towards it, two things can either happen. Either this will be the gratification of a lifetime, and this will be a great thing for you. You know, you've had so much anticipatory utility towards this one thing, you now own it. Life is beautiful. What can also happen is that if you had a lot of anticipatory utility, for those of you that know how dopamine works, you've been building up to this moment for so long, you've had that expectation, you've already had the dopamine release from just expecting this thing to come or to finally be yours. And then once you finally do pay for it, and this payment, if it's high value cash, is gonna be painful, or at least very salient. You might experience it as very negatively because you are losing a resource, and most people are loss averse. And then because you've predicted that you would be super happy, the dopamine explosion that you're waiting for, well, that has already been because of your anticipation towards it. The release has been, and then now if you've been somewhat accurate in predicting how happy you would be as a result of owning this thing, your dopamine is now essentially flatlining. So the ecstasy that you were hoping for has already been had. As a result, the pain or the loss is very high, and the reward has kind of already been had and has faded out. And as a result, your complete excitement for this thing might completely flatline. As I said, can go either way. Does it depend on the type of individual you are? Yes. Does it depend on the value? Yes. Does this also depend on the amount of time that you've worked up towards this high value purchase? Also yes. So as everything within behavioral science, you're gonna have to give me a bit more context. And let's see, so for your second question, to what extent do you think your mobile payment study could have been affected by self-selection bias? Definitely, always. More financially responsible individuals could be more likely to install the money management apps. That is a very, very interesting point, and we did address that as a limitation in the study, also for the previous one, because they were both run on the same data set. Keep in mind, this is a bit difficult to figure out because you've just identified one sample that might skew what we are looking at and might skew them away from the regular consumer. These are super savvy people. However, the first time I installed a financial tracker app was when I could absolutely not keep track of my finances and things were slightly spiraling out of control. Does that make me financially responsible? No, it makes me financially reactive to things not going particularly well. And we've identified quite a few people in that sample as well, where we could quite frankly see them spiral financially. And then every account that they signed up to the app was after a while doing better. Is that financially responsible? If you're really like tipping over the edge and then you're installing an app, it doesn't necessarily make you responsible. It does make you slightly more savvy once you've installed the app, but that says nothing about your behavior beforehand. So I do think you can definitely identify subgroups within these types of data sets, definitely, but they might to some extent cancel each other out.
We've got a couple of comments for you. So Stuart says, good questions. I wonder also if cashless reduces the risk of a run on a bank, particularly during COVID. It occurred to me that folk could have panicked at ATMs.
That is a very good question. Sorry, my laptop is currently completely freaking out. I'm not entirely sure what's going on. As long as you can still hear me, I guess we are fine. Solid. Okay, cool. It has stopped. I don't know why. This laptop's old. This is what it is. Do I think if we stop using cash that we'll have less run on banks? I feel like if you want to get your money out, you'll find a way to get your money out. I find that really difficult to answer these types of questions, because if there's one thing that I know is that, you know, people get creative, and I'm not saying that everyone is an established hacker. I'm just saying that these days it is not very hard. You can learn how to become a hacker via YouTube almost these days. So in terms of whether, you know, banks can feel slightly more safe, no, probably not.
Neil makes a good point that people pay cash for drugs and crypto, but not sure it is curbing demand. Valid.
Good comment.
Julian says Virgin money cards cannot be used on gambling, etc.
Mm-hmm. There are, yeah, so that there are cards which have functionalities blocked. There are several banks and neobanks as well that have these functionalities either blocked by default or that allow the consumer to block them themselves, which is good.
Michael Joyce says there's lots of evidence of the opposite, re cash and vice products. Recipients of funds on government-managed fund cards often buy high-value products like nappies and formula to exchange for goods they can't buy, like alcohol or gambling.
Fair enough. This is the thing, right? If you're doing consumer behavior type studies, what you're trying to identify is a regular type consumer, not necessarily the person who is using their benefits to run an illegal formula business on the side. I do understand your point, and this is why a lot of governments do want to get rid of cash, because it is difficult to track and it does feed into a lot of illegal activity. I'm just not entirely sure that digitization is necessarily the solution to that, because as we've now seen, there's lots of clever people who know their way around that as well, whether that's through crypto or through other channels.
Very true. And Merle, I think on that note, we're going to thank you.
Sure.
There's no more questions in the chat. That was amazing. You're a wealth of knowledge and very much an expert on this topic. For anyone that hasn't, I urge you to go to Money on the Mind. It's a really great blog. Thank you for everyone for bearing with us as well. Sorry about the mishap with the link at the beginning. Not quite sure what happened, but we'll solve that for next time. So Merle, I'm sure if you could see everyone, they'd be giving you a round of applause.
Oh, thank you very much. And for everyone, if you still had some questions or if you're still curious about something, please just reach out. You can find me across social media very, very easily. My name is quite unique in Australia.
#1 in Google search ranking.
Absolutely.
Lots of comments about people loving your blog, and big fan of the presentation you just did. And thank you for the questions, everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. They were great questions and great comments. Well, guys, thanks so much and have a good night.
Bye.
Bye. Yeah.